schedule. We are welcoming Mona Bozdog, Foxdog Studios, and Laura E. Hall with Jan Sesnick, a panel about mixed realities and the crossover between theatre and the creative arts and digital. Jan Sesnick is an artist whose work focuses on sound, music, physical interaction, games, and building new instruments. His recent projects include residencies at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, the Floating Cinema in London, Playable City Lagos, and Time Span in the Scottish Highlands. Much of his work involves building custom instruments such as musical pigsties, slinky instruments, candle-based sound installations, electromechanical mushroom spore reactors, and much more. So with that, I'm going to hand you over to Jan and the speakers. We'll just
Hi, everybody. I didn't realize I was going to get such a full introduction. I apologize. My name's Jan. I'm based currently on the East Coast of the U.S. near Baltimore, in Maryland. And I'm just here to talk everybody through, and I'm not going to say much myself. I think there's plenty for the other panelists to say about their work. And I was just going to go. I wanted to give everybody a quick 1-minute way of saying hello and where you are and what you do. Mona, do you want to go first?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Mona Bozdog. I'm a lecturer in immersive experience design at Abertay University. But I am also a maker. I love to make things that are, playful experiences, not necessarily games per se. And yeah, some of the things that I enjoy are, playing with heritage, playing with site responsive experiences, and playing on islands. So yeah, that's me.
We'll definitely mention the islands at some point, I think. Lloyd and Pete, you want to say hi?
Sure. I'm Pete, and that's Lloyd. We're Foxdog Studios. We create and perform comedy shows, primarily where the comedy is derived from tech, and it relies heavily on audience interaction, normally through smartphones. And our most successful work has been Robot Chef, where the audience control a bad robotic cooking chef to make a horrible meal.
Yeah, we're based in Manchester, UK. And yeah, at the moment, we've sort of taken what we did in live comedy, where it was taking into normal live comedy clubs technology where it wasn't normally put. And we've transferred that into sort of our live streaming, where we've taken, for instance, the Robot Chef and had that being able to be controlled through Twitch. And they can also control a sausage cannon. And we also have a sort of choose your own adventure game, which we do with other comedians live on Twitch as well.
Cool. I mean, I don't know. That seems like kind of like just what everybody does these days, but cool. Anyway, so Laura, do you want to say hi as well?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Laura E. Hall. I'm in Portland, Oregon, USA, and I'm a designer who works on puzzles, escape rooms, installation work that's highly narrative, and video games, digital and VR spaces. I also just wrote a book called Planning Your Escape that's coming out later this year. That's for introducing new players to the world of escape rooms.
Can you, I think you can, I mean, we can get to this later as well, but you can actually pre-order the book already, right?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Cool. So if anybody gets bored during the chat, you can go pre-order the book, come back, and then you can enjoy that when it arrives. So we're here to talk about hybrid experiences or mixed realities. That's the name of the panel, right? So we're in this funny situation with this kind of subject matter where I do get the impression that any conversation about this subject needs to kind of start out with a sort of definition. Like, what are we actually talking about here? You know what I mean? So Mona, how would you kind of characterize the idea of hybrid experiences, or even maybe this mixed realities idea? What do you think defines it or sets it apart?
I'm just laughing because having a conversation with Jan earlier last week, I think we decided we're going to bring multimedia back as a term because it seemed to be doing really well, and then it kind of sizzled away. So yeah, multimedia. I guess that means a lot of different things. To me, I think it is just kind of embracing a form of hybridity that has both digital and physical elements, I guess you would call it. It's, you know, playfulness that kind of unfolds across both physical and digital environments, forms of play that take different forms and different shapes and that borrow from different disciplines. I don't know, I guess, yeah, multimedia is back.
Multimedia is the best term. I mean, I do feel like it's really ripe for a renaissance. It got kind of co-opted, or I don't know. It just, yeah, it really fizzled. I don't know. Laura, do you have any feelings on the term multimedia? We didn't actually talk about that, but I do think it's a fascinating term.
Yeah, I think that that is a term that works. You know, everything sort of has like a 20-year cycle of when it's popular the first time and then comes back after everybody has sort of hashed it out. I think the term that I use for my work is immersive as the genre, which I know is a sort of like overused marketing term currently, but the way I would define that is like the experiences that you're having are not necessarily limited by the four boundaries of the screen, right? So in an interactive space, like there might be a screen involved, but it's also involving the real world in some way.
Yeah, immersive. I think we can come back to the word immersive because I'm scared of it. I just have decided that it's one I'm going to avoid using because I'm terrified of it. But we can certainly come back to that. Lloyd and Pete, there's in your little introduction there, you used a turn of phrase which I thought was really interesting, and I wrote it in my notes, which was the idea that you do comedy shows that rely on technology. You're relying on technology, and then you went on to talk about how bad the technology is. And I just wonder, like, what's that relationship? Because I think a lot of times when people are, I mean, I don't know, when you speak to people, do you, like me, end up in these weird conversations where people assume you're an expert on this stuff and that actually, like, I don't know what I'm doing and I'm like the worst coder in the world, you know, like why do you feel like you need to rely on it? And then why do you enjoy making it bad and break?
I think it's because when we started out doing comedy, we weren't funny and we were terrible performers. So in that way, we relied on the technology for the novelty.
Yeah, just to clarify, it was us as IT consultants wanting to go on stage. There was no comedy before. It wasn't like we were doing sketches and then we were chucking technology on top. This is just what we knew. So we were never really deliberately using tech. It was just what we had. So yeah, it's just there for us. You know, it's just there, part of our show. So I guess when people, yeah, do they think we're experts? I guess we're just doing it, and if it breaks, it has to just be good enough to not fail on stage.
And once we've made something that is good, it's no longer funny. So we normally have to then work backwards and invent a way of doing it that's incredibly impractical to make it funny again.
Yeah, that's kind of that was going to be my follow-up there, is like what makes tech funny, and when is it funny, and is it just when it's broken, or
it's when it's impractical, I think. Yeah. Normally when people say something's broken, when they're like, oh, it's funny when it goes wrong on stage, it's only funny if the audience can perceive what's gone wrong. If you've run out of disk space on stage, that's not funny.
I think there's frustration. You don't want to be frustrating for the audience. That's the bad part of tech going wrong, is, you know, frustration.
Setting on fire is funny.
Yeah,
that's funny.
That's relief.
Yeah. Laura, you sometimes have talked about the idea of which I think kind of ties into this, maybe not the frustration part, or maybe not the comedy part quite as much, but the frustration kind of ties into the idea of creating sort of a seamless experience for people when they play, a kind of lack of friction, I think was the word you used. How is that important to kind of like building these sorts of mixed reality experiences?
Yeah, well, I think, there's a lot of funny moments that happen accidentally when you're playing an escape room, but it's usually when something is going wrong. So I really agree with a lot of that. Yeah, I would say one of the goals for escape room design specifically, not necessarily all of the experiences that I would work on, but in an escape room where you're trying to deliver a cohesive narrative that's in this like really time limited space. The way that I try to work toward that is by designing without friction. That's a friction that is like a reminder that you're not in the game. Like you want people to be able to get into the flow of the story without noticing that they're actually like being shepherded through it. So yeah, the frictionlessness is stuff like hiding the parts of the room that show you how it's working, or like making sure that all of the puzzle indicators are clear, so you're not having to be like, well, I actually don't know how to work this padlock, so what does that mean? And you need some kind of external instruction. But there are moments of friction that sort of arise naturally, like when you don't know how to do something, and like that's really, there's nobody's fault in that, and like those actually are very funny moments most of the time. Depends on the the disposition of the player sometimes, but mostly it's funny.
I'd say, Mona, that some of your projects, I don't know if you'd agree with this, but I wonder if in some ways some of your projects take a slightly different approach, in the sense that they are kind of taking advantage of friction. Like I'm thinking of the kind of group playing of like the kind of crowd playing a game, right? Like that's a really difficult thing to do. And like, do you see that as like a friction you're imposing, or are you trying to like enable the audience to do something? Like which direction are you coming at when you're designing your playful experiences?
That's really interesting, because you think about friction and immersion as kind of being separate, if not somewhat opposite. And I think, whenever we think about immersive, we tend to think that kind of somehow it makes you forget about the screen and makes you forget about the technology that's kind of supporting it. And I guess, to a degree that's true, but also, technology does bring people together. And I think we really love to explore the ways in which is doing that. So I guess, sometimes technology breaks, and when it does, you need to have a plan B. But you're also kind of realizing that everything that the tech does, people can do too. So and Neil Moody, with whom I worked on Breaking Out of the Frame, that was a crowd control game, and it was reliant on a webcam kind of capturing people moving left and right, so that they can move the avatar in the digital space. But because light conditions changed, that didn't really work. So of course he faked it, and I guess that's, is it important? Does it matter whether it's real or fake? Whether the technology is actually central? Or whether you have people there who are just having fun, whether the technology works or not, as long as the illusion that it does is there.
Yeah.
So I guess, yeah, I don't know if that really responds to your question. I don't start with technology. I never start with technology. I always start with a space and the stories that are kind of hidden in it, and then I think about ways in which we can uncover those stories, and we can engage the audience with them through different modes of engagement. So that's where that,
yeah, which I guess then, with the interesting extra bit to that being that project was part of a project sort of about technology, but a sort of like the cultural history of technology, I guess, right?
Yeah, the project that Jan is talking about was concerned with the hidden kind of figures in Dundee's video games history, and those were an army of women who were manufacturing ZX Spectrum computers in the Timex factory. So it's always one of those stories that kind of gets forgotten about, because there are so many other more important narratives rather than the oral her stories of the women who made the computers but were never really encouraged or supported to learn how to use them, and yeah, I guess playing with the stories behind technology to me is more exciting than maybe necessarily the technology itself.
And Lloyd and Pete, I find it in a way, I would argue that you maybe have a slightly similar attitude, in the sense that like the technology itself that you're using isn't necessarily that important. What you're more interested in is the experience of the audience. Would that be right?
Yeah, like originally we started performing to get away from technology. Well, to get away from people who wanted us to build them invoicing systems. But because we had technology, we always thought we would use the technology as a tool, but not try and make the shows about
the
techno,
tech.
about
Yeah,
tech.
there wouldn't be tech jokes in it. It's for a general audience, and in that way, you know, they're going to be very skeptical of technology. You know, they're like, "No, it's not for me. I'm not into video games." So whenever we design stuff, you know, I want them to have a go. So you want to design it to be as simple as possible. In R1, yeah, we bring our own Wi-Fi. We tell them to connect to the Wi-Fi on their phones. That's the hardest part, and then they go on their browser, and we are running on our laptop connected to our Wi-Fi is a little web server, and that's gives them to control the games, and they all play a game. And well, in fact, I think this goes back to that one where it was the crowd controlling something altogether, where yeah, if it was faked or whether it's part of a group. In our one, the basic game that we have, they are given an avatar on the screen, and they can see themselves moving, so they at least feel like having gone through all this effort of connecting to the Wi-Fi, you know, which they might feel like a fool if it didn't work out. At least they were able to join and play and see a button on their phone being pressed that moves something on the projector on the screen.
And because we wanted it to appeal to a general audience, we would prevent people from saying it in publicity material that it was going to be about tech or like to bring your phones, because that would give the wrong impression. We wanted to just spring that on them once we'd got them trapped.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know if you all struggle in the same way I do with when you talk about your projects, but I often like get really frustrated when people will kind of lead the discussion of one of my projects about on the tech. You know, it'll be like, oh, it's like a Raspberry Pi project. I'm like, no, it's a project about emotions, damn it. You know, or like, it's that kind of like, you know, and that can be really frustrating. But yeah, maybe it seems like you're managing that quite well. Do you? It also seems to me like you're actually sticking quite closely to Laura's definition of immersion in a way of like making sure that the audience doesn't see the like all the stuff that's making it work, right? And is that like, because it's just funny because of course I enjoy seeing how something is constructed and learning about how something is constructed, but from an audience standpoint, you don't want them to see that stuff necessarily. Or are there any points where you're okay with them seeing how it works?
We don't like it to be content in the show, but we do like them to see that it is real. So normally, like if we're like playing in a theater, we'll have all of our equipment on the middle of the stage, and all of the wires that connect it all together will just be strewn about, and we'll just stand on top of them. Initially, shows started out like that because we were never given enough setup time to get in and make stuff look good. But then it's important to let the audience know that we have done it, because presumably you could go grab Intel and they could just do this whole thing. They could chuck $1 million at it or something and get like a team of 20 people to build it. And then where there's not as much enjoyment in that. But I think there's enjoyment for the audience in knowing that two grubby lads from Manchester have built it despite not being asked to by Intel.
Yeah, it's interesting that you have to sort of like have there needs to be a certain level of expectations met, you know, by the audiences will have an expectation of what it would look like if you two built this yourselves. And if it was too clean, they maybe wouldn't believe that you had built it yourselves. Laura, what Pete and Lloyd were just kind of slightly alluding to, I guess, is this idea of like, in a sort of game design terminology would be sort of like onboarding or like tutorializing the player. Like, how do you, like the idea that, okay, all they have to do is connect to the Wi-Fi, and then from there, there's this immediate feedback of like, okay, you're in control, right? And you do plenty of stuff with tech, but you also do plenty of stuff with just material objects and things like that. And how do you like onboard somebody for like a physical immersive game? Like, how do you get them so that they like, what's the important steps that get somebody into your game?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's a big question for this type of game design, I think. One of the things that I start with in design is world building, right? So everything that sort of exists in the place that you're interacting with needs to make some type of logical sense for why it's there. So when you're doing that type of work, the sort of inherent logic of what they're seeing and experiencing helps with that onboarding, right? There's also the constraint of the fact that like in the real world, things can only behave in a particular way. So like you're not having to set up a whole elaborate set of rules for like how this box opens because people inherently understand like that the mechanism is going to go a certain way. You can use that though to surprise people. I mean, I would also say, and this sort of speaks to the friction thing that you were discussing before, puzzles are inherently very frictionful, right? Like there's a quote from the book Puzzlecraft, which is really an excellent book if you're interested in this type of design, that says people play puzzle games to deliberately put themselves into a painful position that they're then empowered to free themselves from. So I think, yeah, in terms of onboarding people into that situation, they're going to expect like a certain amount of pain that's just like the natural part of the puzzle solving, but not the extraneous pain that comes from something not working as expected in the real world. You can sort of use that though to subvert expectations in a way. And this is where the use of invisible technology comes in. But when something does not behave as expected, it becomes something new where they have to discover where the lines around that puzzle are and like understand that the rules have suddenly changed within that. That can be a lot of fun.
Which certainly feels like a world building thing too, right? Because the world is not only about the setting you're in, but also the rules of the world that you're currently living in. And Mona, you've taken the sort of world building thing quite literally in some cases, right? Like or it's like, I don't know, I'm not sure if you would define it as world building to like design a game for an island where you're on an island, like that becomes your world, right? So a lot of your work is about outdoor physical public spaces. And do you find it to be a challenge to get people involved in those, or like what does it bring to the kind of table?
Yeah, I guess, like continuing the thread of tutorial or onboarding, I literally take people on a journey. So, whether that is a boat journey that takes them to an island, whether that is a journey through a park that takes them to an old factory where loads of computers were being built in the 80s. I think that journey is really important because it helps ease them into the fictional world that you're building. So I like to work with audio, for example, because I think audio instantly fictionalizes any space. The second you hear a voice in your ear, that space for you is like, oh, big adventure's about to start. So, I like playing around with that. But yeah, I mean, the Inchcolm project that you were talking about, which took place on Inchcolm Island just outside Edinburgh, that was slightly different because that was a kind of a response to the Arrestor. It was almost, I think, quite it was an adaptation, but it was quite taking quite a bit of creative freedom with it. But like the second audience descended on the island, that island became the experience for them. And like then playing the Arrestor in the 12th century abbey on that island kind of brought in all this sensory information and attached it to the video game. And I think that's what's really exciting is when you play around with technology and you manage to somehow bring in all of the physical powers of the body to attach it to that. And I think that's where it becomes like really, really exciting. And after that, when you play the Arrestor, you'll always smell Inchcolm Island and you'll always feel slightly chilly and you're always kind of gonna have that experience. So, it is world building in a way because you're bringing some narratives to it, but I like to not bring narratives to it, but kind of unhide the ones that are already there. So I like to work with site responsive stuff, and that can be, it's Fiona Wilkie who brilliantly kind of summed this up in terms of site specific theater, because she says site can function as structure, as storyteller, and as symbol. And I always play around with these kind of three aspects of sites.
I think there's the other side of it is also super interesting, that then and certainly the people who live in Scotland, or certainly the southeast of Scotland, every time they pass that island again, if they've played it, they will think, oh yeah, that was where I did the thing. Like, so the place itself kind of becomes ends up having a sort of embedded meaning for the players that were involved, which I think is really. I remember when I first moved to Edinburgh, in like the first week I was there, somehow I don't know how I ended up on a bus down to Leith, and I had never been around Edinburgh at all yet. And it took me on this bus all the way down to this huge warehouse where there was this like giant, I guess, Red Bull or something motorcycle stunt show going on with like free drinks. And it was really amazing because like that bus trip for certainly for me, because I'd never been down there before, it was exactly what you were saying. It was this like, it took me literally on this kind of this journey away from the life that I knew into this totally different life and this different reality that I didn't even know physically where I was, let alone this kind of like bridge into this other reality. It was a pretty terrible party, but just to quickly tell everybody, we will probably have some time for questions. So if you have any questions, drop them in the chat, and somebody will. I mean, I'm not looking at the chat now, but somebody will hopefully pull any questions that do come out and ask them accordingly afterwards. Right, I'm going to stop talking about motorcycles. Where was I? Okay, so what are the downsides? I mean, I have this kind of thing where I whenever I chair a panel, I try to like not only talk about how amazing stuff is, like I like to talk about like what's the downside of this approach. Like, is there? I mean, so Lloyd and Pete, one thing that I find really interesting about your work on your website is that you have like loads of different projects, right? You have the comedy show, you have games that you make on like browser games, you have all these other things. And like, is that because these different platforms can provide different things, and maybe this sort of mixed reality thing has some limitations, or is it just because you enjoy it, or like, is that a reaction to the downsides of an approach to the performance style approach?
A common theme through all of them is some sort of is normally some sort of programming or electronics or something like that, and there's lots of different ways of doing that. And when we were younger, we were in bands and stuff, so we've got music coming in there, so we always just do our hobbies basically, and the more novelty we bring into our performances, I think we find that better. And normally if we like today, I found this big bit of wood,
it's a good bit of wood.
I'm gonna make something with wood. And I think that's how we've ended. Look, no, you bought plasticine, and now he's making plastic. Show him your plasticine model.
No, this is just.
Well, you've just started.
Yeah, it was like I don't know. It's there's no real. I guess we don't really see. We just like coming up with ideas, and I guess all programming has allowed us to do is just stick things together. But the limits of us doing the live show, which I guess is what this is about, the hybrid of being live, is like the kind of reach that we would have is limited because everyone has to be at a certain venue. So for us, trying other, more like, games and stuff allows more people to see it, and like a video allows someone to share it, which may give them a glimpse at something that is in the live show.
Yeah, like the things we've worked on for the longest in our whole life have been like our live shows, but comparatively very few people have seen them. I think the most popular thing that's ever been on the internet that we were like, oh, let's just make a video with this new camera, and we just hooked up some of our existing stuff to make a robotic blending machine, and then that got shared around on Reddit loads.
A drum powered blender. And that's like the most popular thing we've ever done in terms of views, and it took us like 10-15 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, there's I mean, certainly with my projects, there's an interesting thing where like I see a video that somebody will have shared of it, and I'm like, God, that's like doesn't capture the project at all. But then people tend to watch it. Like that documentation thing is really a struggle, and like is somebody watching a video of an escape room happening? Is that at all like doing an escape room, Laura? Like, I would guess not.
It's very much not. This sort of touches on the downsides element as well. For all of the types of work that I do, so escape rooms, right, an in-person experience that's very geographically locked. In my experience, the stuff that I'm interested in making, not necessarily the best games, but the ones that I have found the most fun, have really interesting, playful sets, right? And that is something that you tend to have to go in person physically to do. But even with something like an alternate reality game, which we haven't really touched on, but those are sort of treasure hunts that play out online. There's puzzles, but there's the important part of ARG stuff is that there's like in-person meetup type of things, or a dead drop where somebody has like left a clue for a player to go out and pick up. Those are also sort of necessarily like limited in the scope of the people that are able to play them. Those tend to be designed for like a very, very deep and intense experience, but for a relatively small audience who can show up for however long the game is running, for how, you know, if it's a month or whatever. And I really love that type of work because it is really fun to connect with people in that time. It's this ephemeral moment sort of thing. But it isn't really something that is like, you can't spreadsheet that, because it's like, well, you know, you've changed the lives deeply of these like 75 people, and maybe now 2 of them are getting married, and like this other person got a tattoo of the symbol from this game on their body, which I met my spouse through an ARG, so like that's like very real. I know multiple couples that have met through those games. But yeah, the downsides of those things are like that they are time limited in some ways. The potential audience is very limited, and then for a lot of the other interactive parts of it that are like taking place in the real world, like very physically limited, right? And especially now, the pandemic stuff is happening. Like there are sort of lighter touch stuff that I've been working on. I do ephemera storytelling projects, which are sort of presentations of letters and things that are in people's pockets. I tend to design those for the physical, tangible pleasure of like reading and flipping through them, but that is something that is possible to digitize. So that's something that I'm like playing around with. And then, yeah, one final downside to note is like actually running an escape room is like not designing it. You design it once, and then the rest of the time you're operating a venue and a ticket selling business. So like that is, yeah, a major part.
Totally. Mona, I imagine it was similar maybe experience for you in terms of there's the design, there's the research process, the design process, and then there's the actually running of the thing. Like, is that a challenge? Do you find that to be more challenging, or is that something that you just naturally get into?
Yeah, it's always, it's a big build up, particularly for the things that I do, which take the shape of events. So they happen once. So, you invest 6 months of work, you work with tons and tons and tons of people. There's a lot of really kind of like frantic agitation, putting everything together, testing everything, making sure everything works. Something breaks, then you fix it, something else breaks, and it's like nerve-wracking, and then it happens once, and then that's pretty much it. So it's always, it's weird because particularly when you're in academia, then like you disseminate the work through writing, but it's not the same thing. You write about the thing, you take photos of the thing, you record the thing, it's still not the thing. And I think it's so important to have that live experience, and particularly now with the pandemic, that's it is pretty much impossible. So I think it's challenging a lot of us to think about how to make them more accessible, how to open them up to more people, how to get funding to allow you to do this thing time and time again.
Yeah, the academic thing is, well, as you know, Mona, something I personally have certainly struggled a lot with. But it is an interesting thing, and Laura, you've been writing a book. I mean, presumably the book you're writing will be read by more people than probably most games that you will have designed, right? So who will have played more than the players of the games you've designed for. So there's this interesting thing where you're documenting it or you're researching it, you're preparing a thing all about it, but then it's not the experience of it. Whereas Lloyd and Pete, you guys are, I think you're sort of blissfully free of the requirements of academia and writing about your work. You're much more focused on that kind of like individual person to person experience. Do you still feel a pressure to kind of document things and get them out there in a way that isn't just the show?
Before the pandemic, like we had basically nothing online, which made it very difficult to get, like, if a promoter, you wanted to get booked on a night, how can you show the person what you're going to do? So even though it's not academia and it's not writing an official report, still having some documentation of your performance, it would have been probably financially slightly more helpful than having nothing. But we didn't really have much interest in producing anything that wasn't just doing the show. But since the pandemic and now all of our content we are doing directly online, the content sort of becomes the documentation. Like the thing that we're doing, which is like a virtual, it's not an escape room because they don't have to solve puzzles. It's just an excuse for comedians to shout at the public across the internet. But like our Escape the North, like those recordings of those Twitch streams are then going onto YouTube and people can watch those. And then they've been coming to the live stream from seeing them.
Yeah. And I guess, well, the pressure that we felt when we were doing the live show, why we didn't really have time to record it properly, is, you know, we'd, when you do something technical, you have to keep it working. And, you know, we're packing it all into our car. It's not in a van. It's very low overhead way of doing it. You know, we're packing all our equipment into a car, driving it from Manchester to London and back. And yeah, then when we do, say, the Edinburgh Fringe, we're doing 25 days in the basement, and you have to put it on stage and off stage in 15 minutes. We're carrying a trestle table with all these robotics dangling off it.
The venue's flooded.
There was a lot of maintenance ongoing that kept us busy. Keeping this kind of live experience going and making it possible.
So we never got time. Like, look at this. This is my keyboard that I have to use on stage. Where are these keys? Right? We've got no time to worry about documenting it, or I can't even play. I mean, I've got all the keys on the keyboard.
Those nobody uses those keys. Actually, it's a secret piano. A pianist.
I don't need them.
Definitely
Yeah,
not.
yeah.
I don't need them.
They're just extra. They're just optional keys. I have a bunch of follow-up questions, but there does seem to be some questions coming in. So I might just look over at my other monitor and see. Okay, here's one. I don't know who wrote this. I'd love to know more from Laura too about her work on long-running ARGs, like recently solved game Find Satoshi. Were you involved in that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I did I can explain about the details of that. So 14 years ago, there was an early ARG called Perplexity that was, it was run by a company in London, and they released puzzle cards as their method of funding it. So again, ARG is like a sort of treasure hunt thing. The story plays out online through blogs or interacting with characters over email or something. So there's a live element to it. It's this like temporal thing. And then people come together online to like meet and chat and solve stuff. But then there's like real life game components to it. In the case of Perplexity, there were like multiple live events that happened where people were traveling all over various cities in the world solving puzzles. So it was really fun. In this set of puzzle cards, there were a range of difficulties. The easiest were red, and then all the way up to silver, which were meant to be like nearly impossible. One of the silver cards was called Billion to One, and that was a guy's face, just a selfie. Down the side, it said in Japanese, "Find me." And then the hint line for this game also at the time said, "My name is Satoshi." So the idea was that we would be tasked with solving this thing just using this guy's name and photograph. And then, last December, it was actually finally solved. So the 2020 was redeemed. That happened because I kept this website going for the entire time, 14 years. So I can see that the question is like, are there systems or methods to how you set something like that up and keep it going for so long? Sheer stubbornness, I think, force of will in some ways. All of the game materials are basically gone. They shredded all of the cards after a while that were left unsold. So like all the websites have gone down because the company pivoted. So we're the fans are the ones kind of keeping up the torch. But yeah, early last year, this like huge YouTube channel called Inside a Mind, they have, I think, 600,000 subscribers, did a video about this unsolved mystery. And that was what sort of reignited interest in it. But again, because I have been stubbornly keeping the website going this entire time, there was like a place for all of that energy to go. And then in December, you know, people were finding themselves with a lot of time at home. And this man in Germany used reverse AI image searching to like run this photograph through a database. And there was like an actual legitimate facial match with a photo that had been uploaded, I think in 2018. And then we emailed him and that was him. So 14 years later, that's solved. It's on findsatoshi.com if you want to like read the story. But yeah, my spouse was actually the one that designed that card originally, that we met playing that game. And so he's like very faithfully kept that secret as a favor to me to not reveal any details this whole time. So
that adds a whole other level of amazingness to the story. But that's interesting. Do you feel like a sort of like emptiness now that that game is closed out?
Not emptiness. I've always believed that it was possible to solve that. And this is all very related to the sort of stuff that we've been talking about. Like the thing with ARGs that I've always found really enjoyable, and the thing that's drawn me to this type of work is the fact that, you know, you can play the game at the time and you can read about it later, but like only actually playing it gives you that experience. I mean, to speak to the documentation thing, there was actually an ARG that ran late last year called Arcana. I think it's arcana-game.com, but they have a really lovely write-up that summarizes the entire experience. It played out through Instagram. And I was like, this is the best ARG documentation I've ever seen. Like, it kind of gives you a sense of what it was like, although there's nothing like the thrill of actually seeing the things being posted live. But yeah, I feel very happy. I'm not sad that it's over. I did always think it was possible, but I just never knew when that was actually going to resolve. So
that's totally amazing story. There's another question, or at least a sort of a thought that I think can be responded to. I wonder if the reasons why some kind of tech issues are funny and some aren't in Lloyd and Pete's sketches has anything to do with what Laura mentioned about creating painful situations that you have some control of. Like, I think most people would know immediately what to do if their computer went on fire. It's debatable, but a lot of people would feel totally helpless if their CPU maxed out. I think that the extra bit I would maybe tease out of that from Martin is like, does that actually end up like sort of revealing something interesting about our relationship with technology, right? Like, is that like, Lloyd and Pete, do you feel like in some way your show, because when I look at your shows online or the stuff that the documentation that you post to the shows online, to me, I do feel like there's a certain thing where it's like, these are shows that are about the limitations of technology and about like people's relationship with technology and like that kind of like weird problematic association we have, and then like that something breaks and we have one reaction to when it breaks a certain way, but another reaction if it breaks another way, or like, I don't know, is that something you're thinking about while you're designing these experiences?
I think we try and make stuff flimsy, and that's then it just ends up breaking anyway. I think what makes, going back to like what makes stuff funny and or not funny, is like, it's if the audience, first of all, the audience has to believe that we could fix it. Even so, the first thing to do is to not get angry, which took me many years to overcome, and to pretend like that you can fix it. And even if something goes wrong that's, say, not immediately understandable, a good technique was just to make it funny, is to like pause the show and explain why it's gone wrong. And if you do that in a really deadpan and calm way, even though the show could be ruined, then that normally makes it funny if people think that we don't care or that we've planned it in some way.
Yeah. So like the cleanest way that it goes wrong at the moment is the robot chef at the end. So there's a frying pan on the table that's just cooked up sausages and beans. And then they have to lift it up with a robotic magnetic crane that we've built and put it onto a device, which is basically just a panel on a motor that flips it over. and them carrying that over can often go wrong. Oh, sorry, I think we're trying to show there's a bit
there.
overexposed.
If you zoom in, you can see it.
There's a table with a bunch of junk on it, and that is our living. And you know, that often goes wrong, and like the motor might get jammed up. It's not perfect, and we always say we need to fix it and make it better. So it might, something mechanically can always go wrong there, because we are giving players, they are controlling augmented reality characters on this table, and they are controlling robotics in our house or on stage, essentially anonymously, and they can either do it correctly or do it incorrectly. And yeah, if something goes wrong and we do need to pause it, we have a massive pause button appear on the screen and the sound like a blink, and then we try and address what has gone wrong, because it can be quite subtle, like a tiny rope getting caught in a motor, and then try and undo it there. But yeah, it's trying to make those bits entertaining when it's going wrong whilst you're trying to fix it. We'll put on the lounge elevator music during that part and try and make it calm for ourselves so we can continue the show, because we are the ones who have to fix it. There's not someone backstage.
Although the pause button we found in our last performance no longer pauses the robots, but it does pause the characters, which means that we pause it when they're doing something wrong, and once it's paused, they cannot stop doing it. So we'll be fixing that later.
Or you should just build a whole thing around that, I guess, right? Like, like all the players are paused and helpless, but the robot is like picking them off one by one and dropping them into the fire. And yeah, that would be so. Another great question just came in. Actually, probably for Mona, I would say, like, can you comment on the balance of steered versus emergent narrative and gameplay in the experience? Would you say, Mona, that your work goes, like, which direction would you kind of lean towards when you're designing your games?
I think, you know, and I'm not the first person to say this, there are some pretty amazing talks from designers and narrative designers in general, talking about, you know, giving these prompts for experience and then letting your players or letting your audience make what they want out of them. So just giving them the playground and giving them the toys and then say, go play. And I think it's really interesting because I have quite a funny story from InchCon. So some of the audience members went on the different side of the island than everybody else because they wanted to be alone and have the fully immersive experience. And they just found like a random note that wasn't put there by us or anything. It wasn't part of the experience, but it completely derailed their entire narrative. They built everything around it. Yeah, that was you, Sandy. I just saw it in the chat. And you know, like their entire experience was built about this random note with, I think it was something with a baby that was lost, or it had nothing to do with the overall narrative, which was again like to do with guilt and loss and redemption and all this refuge in general and humanity. So in a way it fit, but they were convinced it was part of the experience. So everything else that they found on the island kind of like supported that one thing. And you know, I think that's beautiful. I think that's what you're meant to do, you know, like place some narrative props and trust your players and trust your audience to make what they want of them, because I don't think we trust our players enough to bring their own imagination. And I think that's where
I don't trust anyone who plays anything I make. I have a complete distrust. Whereas Laura, I think you've used a phrase before, like being on rails versus I don't know what the opposite of being on rails would be. Like, how would you see those two? I mean, you do both, I would say. But so, like, how would you approach the two different approaches?
Yeah, well, so like in an escape room where people are paying for like a timed entertainment experience, we've done some more experimental and freeform versions of that, but like we've kind of settled on like we want to deliver a particular narrative. We want to get everybody to at least a certain point in the story so that even if they fail, they're seeing like the end of the game. So we're actually starting to design stuff that doesn't really have a fail state. We just sort of shortcut people through things. So I would describe that as being on rails, like a train where they're just being steered toward the end. But of course, that all should be invisible to them. Like they shouldn't be able to sense that they're being skipped over parts of the story, or to know that they're like in danger of like actually not completing it. There's a sort of lot of finessing that goes into that, but that's because it's like in this time constraint. I do the sort of ephemera installation work, and I would consider that like the flip side of that, because that's untimed. It's like a totally internal experience versus this external thing where you're like being influenced by the set and like all of the stuff around you. So the ephemera stuff might be presented like in a desk or a suitcase or an envelope or something. But you choose, you know, to read through stuff, to read between the lines or interpret what you think these different writers are trying to say, or what it means that they've written this one thing, but they had this object in their pocket at the same time. You know, and I make that because like it's the emergent stuff that I think is fascinating. I think like I call that a game when I'm describing it too, because like it requires the interaction of the person and the interpretation of the person. But the experience that they're having is totally unique because of how they're touching all of the items and experiencing it in their own way. So yeah, that's the sort of, I guess, internal reaction to having to make all of the other stuff that is like so tightly structured.
Right. So you kind of, yeah, it's your anti-rail, yeah, I mean, I think that's super fascinating, because and it actually ends up, that's to me where I start seeing where our worlds, this world that we're kind of talking about, borrows so much from games, and maybe particularly video games, is this idea that like giving the sensation of having total freedom and everything, but actually everything being super guided and super tight, and actually the experience is being given to you. But what video games struggle to do is that really super open world, the open kind of like responsive, tangible thing. And that to me is really what can be augmented by the augmented realities of these experiences. And certainly theater is the same way. It's just like you're constantly responding to people, even if you've got these technical systems built into it. I think we might need to call it there. I guess, I mean, unless there are any last questions, but I think, yeah, let's call it there. I thought that was a good chat. Sometimes it's good to just stop, sometimes it's good to stop while you're ahead. I think we're ahead. I don't think we're behind. So thanks, Lloyd and Pete. Thanks, Mona. Thanks, Laura. And thanks, Lucy. I'll let you take it away from here.